Volume 1, Chapter 1 of the Old Manor House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Old Manor House by Charlotte Turner Smith. Volume 1, Chapter 1. In an old manor house in one of the most southern cities of England, resides some few years since the last of a family that had for a long series of years possessed it. Mrs Rayland was the only survivor of the three co-heiresses of Sir Hildebrand Rayland, one of the first of those to whom the title of baronet had been granted by James the First. The name had been before of great antiquity in the country, and the last baronet having only daughters to share his extensive possessions, these ladies had been educated with such very high ideas of their own importance, that they could never be prevailed upon to lessen, by sharing it with any of those numerous suitors who for the first 40 or 50 years of their lives surrounded them. And Mrs Barbara the eldest, and Mrs Catherine the youngest, died single, one at the age of 70, and the other that of 68. By which events the second, Miss Grace, saw herself at the advanced age of 69 sole inheritor of the fortunes of her house, without any near relation, or indeed any relation at all, whom she chose to consider as entitled to possess it after her death. About 4 miles from the ancient and splendid seat she inhabited, dwelt the only person who could claim any affinity with the Rayland family. This was a gentleman of the name of Somerive, who was considered by the people of the country as heir at law, as he was the grandson of one of the sisters of Sir Hildebrand. But Mrs Rayland herself, whose opinion was more material, since it was all at her own disposal, did not by any means seem to entertain the same idea. The venerable lady and her 2 sisters had never beheld this their relation with the eyes of their friendly interest, nor had they ever intended towards him that generous favour which they had so much the power to afford, and which could not have failed to prove very acceptable, since he had married early in life, and had a family of 2 sons and 4 daughters to support on the produce of an estate which, though he funded himself, did not bring in a clear £500 a year. Various reasons, or rather prejudices, had concerned to occasion this coolness on the part of the ladies towards their cousin. Their aunt, who had married his ancestor, had, as they had always been taught, degraded herself extremely by giving herself to a man who was a mere yeoman. The son of this union had, however, been received and acknowledged as the cousin of the illustrious heiress of the house of Rayland, but following most plebeian-like the unaspiring inclination of his own family, he had fallen in love with a young woman, who lived with them as companion, when it was believed that, as he was a remarkably handsome man, he might have lifted his eyes with impunity to one of the ladies. This occasioned an estrangement of many years, and had never been forgiven. The recollection of it returned with acrimonious violence, when the son of this imprudent man imitated his father, 25 afterwards, and married a woman, who had nothing to recommend but her beauty, simplicity, and goodness. However, notwithstanding the repeated causes of complaint this luckless family of Somerive had given to the austere and opulent inhabitants of Rayland Hall, the elder lady had on her deathbed recollected that, though dismayed by the alloy of unworthy alliances, they carried in their veins a portion of that blood which had circulated in those of the august personage Sir Orlando de Rayland, her grandfather, and she therefore recommended Mr Somerive and his family, but particularly his youngest son, who was named, by reluctantly obtained permission, after Sir Orlando, to the consideration of her sisters, and even gave to Mr Somerive himself a legacy of £500, a gift which her sisters took so much amiss, for they possessed between them a yearly income of near twice £500, that it had nearly rendered her injunction abortive. and they treated the whole family for some time afterwards with the greatest coolness, and even rudeness, as if to convince them that though Mrs Rayland had thus acknowledged their relationship, it gave them no claim whatever on the future kindness of her surviving sisters. For some years afterwards, the dinners, to which in great form the whole family were invited twice a year, were entirely omitted, and none of them admitted to the honour of visiting at the Hall but Orlando, then a child of 9 or 10 years old, and even his introduction was principally owing to the favour of an old lady, the widow of a clergyman, who was among the ancient friends of the family, that still enjoyed the privilege of being regularly sent for in the old family coach once a year, a custom which, originating in the days of Sir Hildebrand, was still retained. This lady was a woman of sense and benevolence, and had often attempted to do offences to the Somerive family, with their rich maiden relations; but the height of her success amounted to no more than obtaining a reward of the very little notice that had ever been taken of them, after those capricious fits of coldness which sometimes happened, and once, some time after the death of the elder Mrs Rayland, bringing Orlando to the Hall in her hand, whom she had met by chance fishing in a stream that ran through their domain, without being children, for encouraging an idle child to catch minnows, or for leading him all dirty and wet into their parlour, at a time when the best embroidered chairs, done by the hands of Dame Gertrude Rayland, were actually unpampered and uncovered for the reception of company. There was indeed in the figure, face, and manner of the infant Orlando something so irresistible, that if Mesdames Alto Disfron and Magrath had seen him, they would probably have been softened in his favour; and this something had always so pleaded for him with the 3 equally formidable ladies his relations, that notwithstanding the opposition of their favourite maid, who was in person and feature well worthy to make the 4th in such a group, and the tales of their old and confidential butler, who did not admire the introduction of any competitor whatever, Orlando had always been in some degree of favour, even when his father, mother, and sisters were shut out, and his elder brother entirely disclaimed as a wild and incorrigible boy, who had been caught in the fact of hunting divers cats, and shooting one of their guinea hens. Orlando, though not at all less wild than his brother, and too artless to conceal his vivacity, was still endured. A new half-crown from each of the ladies was presented to him on every return to school, together with abundance of excellent advice; and if any one observed that he was a remarkably handsome boy, the ladies never contradicted it, though when the same observation was made as to the rest of the family, it was declared to be most absurd and utterly unfounded in truth. To the beauty indeed of any female of the ladies of Rayland Hall had a particular objection, but that of the Miss Somerives was above all obnoxious to them; nor could they ever forget the error the grandfather of these children had committed in marrying for her beauty the young woman, whose poverty having reduced her to be their humble companion, they had considered as an inferior being, and had treated with supercilious insolence and contempt. To those, therefore, to whom her unlucky beauty was transmitted, they bore irreconcilably enmity, even in the second generation; and had any one been artful enough to have suggested that Orlando was like his grandmother, it would probably have occasioned the loss of even the slight share of favour he possessed. When Orlando was about 12 years old, the younger of the 3 antique heiresses died. She left not, however, even a small legacy to the Somerive family, but gave everything she possessed to her surviving sister. Yet even by this lady, though the coldest and most unsociable tempered of the 3, Orlando was not entirely forgotten. She left him the Bible she always used in her closet, and £10 to buy mourning. The other members of his family were not even named. One only of the Mrs Raylands now remained, a woman who, except regularly keeping up the payment of the annual alms which had by her ancestors been given once a year to the poor of her parish, was never known to have done a voluntary kindness to any human being; and though she sometimes gave away money, it was never without making the wretched petitioner pay most dearly for it, by many a bitter humiliation; never but when it was surely known, and her great goodness, her liberal donation to such and such people, was certainly related with exaggeration, at the 2 market towns within 4 or 5 miles of her house. With a very large income and a great annual saving, her expenses were regulated exactly by the customs of her family. She lived generally alone at the old Hall, which had not received the slightest alteration, either in its environs or its furniture, since it was embellished for the marriage of her father Sir Hildebrand in 1698. Twice a year, when courts were held for the manors, there were tenants' feasts, and twice there was a grand dinner, to which none were admitted but a neighbouring nobleman, and the 2 or 3 titled people who resided within 10 miles. Twice too in the course of the year the family of Somerive were invited in form, but Mrs Rayland generally took the same opportunity of asking the clergy of the surrounding country with their wives and daughters, the attorneys and apothecaries of the adjoining towns with theirs, as if to conceive Somerive that they were to expect no distinction on account of the kindred they claimed to the house of Rayland. And indeed it was on these occasions that Mrs Rayland seemed to take peculiar pleasure in mortifying Mrs Somerive and her daughters, who dreaded these dinners as those of their greatest penance, and who at Christmas, one of the periods of these formal dinners, have blessed more than once the proportionate Snow, important and magisterial personage. The body coachman of Mrs Rayland did not choose to venture himself, or the 6 sleek animals of which he was sole governor, for on these occasions it was the established rule to send for the family with the same solemnity and the same parade that had been used ever since the first sullen and reluctant reconciliation between Sir Hildebrand and his sister, when she dared to deviate from the fastidious arrogance of her family, and to marry a man who farmed his own estate, and who, though long settled as a very respectable landowner, had not yet written a meagre after his name. But when the snow fell not, and the ways were passable, or when in summer no excuse was left, and the rheumatism of the elder or the colds of the younger ladies could not be pleaded, the females of the family of Somerive were compelled to endure in all their terrific and tedious forms the grand dinners at the Hall. And though on these occasions the mother and the daughters endeavoured by the simplicity of their dress and the humility of their manners to disarm the haughty dislikes which Miss Rayland never took any pains to conceal, they never could obtain from her even as much as common civility as she deigned to bestow on the ladies who were not connected with her. And Mr Somerive had often been so much hurt by her supercilious behaviour towards his wife and daughters, that he had frequently resolved that they should never again be exposed to endure it. But these resolutions his wife, hateful as the ceremony was to her, always contrived to prevail upon him to give up, rather than incur the hazard of injuring her family by an unpardonable offence against a capricious and ill-natured old woman, who, however oddly she behaved, was still by many people believed to intend giving all her fortune to those who had undoubtedly the best claim to it. Others indeed thought, with more appearance of probability, that she would endow an hospital or divide it among public charities. When the young Orlando was at home and accompanied his family in these visits, the austere visage of Mrs Rayland was alone seen to relax into a smile. As he grew older this particularly was observed evidently to increase, insomuch that the neighbours observed, and whatever aversion the old lady had to feminine beauty, she did not detest that which nature had very liberally bestowed on Orlando, who was now 17, and was not only one of the finest looking lads in the country, but had long since obtained all the knowledge he could acquire at a neighbouring grammar school, from whence his father now took him, and began to consider of plans for his future life. The eldest son, who would, as the father fondly hoped, succeed to the Rayland estate, he had sent to Oxford, where he had been indulged in his natural turn to expense, and his father had suffered him to live rather suitably to what he expected than to what he was sure of. In this Mr Somerive had acted extremely wrong, but it was from motives so natural that his error was rather lamented than blamed. An error, however, and of the most dangerous tendency, he had now discovered it to be. Young Somerive had violent passions, and an understanding very ill suited to their management. He had early in life seized with avidity the idea, which servants and tenants were ready enough to communicate, that he must have the Rayland estate, and had very thoughtlessly expressed this to those who failed not to repeat it to their present mistress, tenacious of her power, and jealous of every attempt to encroach on her property. He had besides trespassed on some remote corners of her manors, and her gamekeeper had represented him as a terrible depredator among her partridges, pheasants, and hares. These offences, added to the cat chases, and tying canisters to the tails of certain dogs, of which he had been convicted in the early part of his life, had made so deep an impression against him, that now, whenever he was at home, the family were never asked; and insensibly, from calling now and then to inquire after her while Mrs Rayland lay ill of a violent fit of the gout, Orlando had been admitted to drink his tea at the Hall, then to dine there, and at last, as winter came on with stormy evenings and bad roads, he had been allowed to sleep in a little tapestry room next to the old library at the end of the north wing, a division of the house so remote that from inhabited by the female part, or indeed by any part, of the family, that it could give no ideas of indecorum even to the eye and prudity of Mrs Rayland herself. Though Orlando was of a temper which made it impossible for him to practise any of those arts by which the regard of such a woman could be secured, and though the degree of favour he had obtained was long rather a misery than a pleasure to him, his brother beheld the progress he made with jealousy and anger, and began to hate Orlando for having gained advantages of which he openly avowed his disdain and contempt. At his expenses, which his father could no longer support, had by this time obliged him to quit the university. He was now almost always at home, and his sneering reproaches, as well as his wild and unguarded conversation, rendered that home every day less pleasant to Orlando; while the quiet asylum he had obtained in the Hall, in a room adjoining to that where a great collection of books were never disturbed in their long slumber by any human being but himself, endeared him to the gloomy abode of the Sibyl, and recoiled him to the penance he was still obliged to undergo, for he was now become passionately fond of reading, and thought the use of such a library cheaply earned by acting as a sort of chaplain, reading the psalms and lessons every day, and the service in very bad weather, with a sermon on Sunday evening; and he even gradually forgot his murmurings at being imprisoned on Sundays and on Fridays in the great old long-bottomed coach, while it was dragged in a most sullen pace either to the next parish church, which was indeed at but a short distance from the mansion, or to that of a neighbouring town, whither on some propitious and sunny days of summer the old lady loved to proceed in state, and to display her rustic or more enlightened neighbours a specimen of the magnificence of the last century. But as history must conceal no part of the truth, from partiality to the hero it celebrates, it must not be denied that the young Orlando had, though insensibly and almost unknown to himself, another motive for submitting with a good grace to pass much of his time in a way, for which thinking, as he thought, the prospect of even boundless wealth could have made him no compensation. To explain this, it may be necessary to describe the persons who from his 9th year, when he became first so much distinguished by Mrs Rayland, till his 18th, composed the household of which he, during that period, occasionally made a part. End of Volume 1, Chapter 1. Recording by Elaine Webb, Bristol, England.